welcome to MedCity News's Invest Conference. Today is our final day. I hope you've been enjoying some of our content that are both live and on demand. I am Arundhati Parmar. I'm the editor-in-chief of MedCity News. So today we're discussing interoperability. Interoperability has been somewhat like the holy grail in healthcare, highly coveted and yet highly elusive. Now with certain information blocking rules and other rules that are going into effect from the CMS, we can sort of look at a future that is less siloed, where data is less sequestered than before, and patients can access data a little more quickly. Today's panel is going to discuss all of that, how far we have come and where we need to go from here, because the work is far from being done. So I wanted to go ahead and introduce our panel today. So the discussion today is interoperability finally, how the final CMS regulations empower patients. First up is our moderator, Niko Skievaski. He's the president and co-founder of Redox, which of course has made a big name in the world of interoperability. Niko leads his team in helping healthcare organizations fulfill the promise of digital health, resulting in better patient outcomes and efficiencies for healthcare providers. In this role, he was named to Forbes 2017 30 Under 30 list of visionaries reinventing healthcare. Prior to founding Redox, Niko worked at Epic, one of the largest tech companies in the world, and as an entrepreneur and advisor to startups. After Epic, he co-founded 100 State, Wisconsin's largest co-working community, and created ICD-10 Illustrated, a satirical book, illustrated medical billing codes. Niko has an MA degree in economics from Boston University and a BS degree in economics and international business from the Arizona State University's W.P. Carey School of Business. He will be our moderator today. Welcome to you, Niko. BJ Boyle is Senior Vice President and General Manager for Acute and Payer Markets at PointClickCare. In this role, BJ is responsible for leading a team that is focused on enabling hospitals, health systems, and their long-term and post-acute care partners to better communicate, collaborate, and share critical patient data. Prior to joining PointClickCare, BJ was Director of Solution Strategy and Development for Cerner Extended Care and Director of Product Management for Resource Systems. BJ holds a BS in Information Systems from University of Mount Union, MBA from Point Park University, and Executive Certificate in Healthcare Leadership from University of Missouri, Kansas City. Welcome to you, BJ. Sarah Krug, CEO of Cancer 101 and Health Collaboratory. Sarah is the CEO of Cancer 101, a patient advocacy organization whose mission is to help patients and care partners navigate cancer. She's also the founder and CEO of Health Collaboratory, a global innovation hub that paves the path for participatory co-design and collaboration in healthcare, with a focus on amplifying the voice of the patient and care partner in the design, development, and continuous improvement of healthcare innovations. She previously held the position of Global Education Director as well as Patient Advocacy Lead at Pfizer. She established the Global Investigator-Initiated Research Program at the company. Before joining Pfizer, Sarah conducted clinical research at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. Welcome, Sarah. And last but not least, we have Michael Palantoni. He is the Vice President of Platform Services at Athenahealth. Michael leads the platform division and is accountable for business outcomes and innovation of an international 300-person product team. By focusing Athenahealth's platform efforts on services specific to the needs of healthcare organizations, Athenahealth has decreased the friction and administrative burden on the clients, improved the clinical experience, and simplified patients' access to their data. Michael is the leader of the Athenahealth Marketplace, initially known as More Disruption Please, which was the first open API-driven marketplace where third-party developers and customers could build and sell turnkey, tightly integrated applications in healthcare. Welcome to you, Michael. Before I turn it over to Niko and the panel discussion, I wanted to mention to the audience that please feel free to put questions in the chat, and Niko will weave them where appropriate in the discussion. Over to you, Niko.
Hey, everybody. I am super excited to chat about interoperability this morning with all of these lovely panelists, or I guess this afternoon for some people, depending on where you're at. Um, we got BJ here, Sarah, Michael, if you want to, there he is. Awesome. So I want to just start off with kind of level setting on the regulations that were alluded to in that introduction. So panelists, what I'm going to try to do is kind of hit on a couple of the high points of it, and then feel free to throw in where I may have missed or emphasis. And then we'll dive into kind of some questions around those. So it's funny, it was like about a year and a half ago, at the beginning of 2020, when CMS and the ONC released a coordinated set of rules around interoperability. I had predicted that 2020 would be all about interoperability. Little did I know there was a pandemic on our heels that would result in me not going to the barber for a whole year. So that changed, and the rules were actually pushed back accordingly based on what happened there. But really, the spirit of the regulations were to get the data into the hands of patients, putting patients front and center with controlling access and interoperability. And the mechanism to do that was through a standardized API using FHIR version 4, using SMART as an authentication mechanism. And of course, patients won't directly interact with the API, but they'll interact with applications that are developed on top of it. So I see it as the government said, it's really an approach of, if we build it, they will come. If we create the APIs and make it open to developers, then developers will build applications that patients will actually use. So that's kind of the first sort of pillar of the regulations. The second one was the ONC defined what information blocking is, what it means when an EHR or a health system or a provider doesn't share information appropriately, and kind of change the paradigm to make it an opt-out model where they automatically need to opt into data sharing. And it also introduced penalties for the entities who are data blocking. So kind of put some teeth around data sharing. And then finally, the third aspect is the regulations finally pulled payers into the mix in a way that they've never been obligated to before, asking them to both share data directly with patients as well as with each other, which is a new thing in the space because payers have largely been left out of the interoperability discussion up until these regulations happen. So that's my quick summary. I'm going to stop talking so much for the rest of the time here, but panelists, did I miss anything broad about those? Anything you want to add?
Niko, I think you got it. My quarantine haircut wasn't as successful as yours, but the only thing I'd add is maybe really focusing on putting that patient in the center of the process, as you said. But I think it's also then how do we empower the providers and the care team members to do that on behalf of the patient too, is a big part of it. So, I don't think we imagine everyone just getting all their data now and running with it. I think it's highlights the complexity of the system and how do we do that?
Yeah, for sure. So one thing I wanted to ask, these regulations have been out for more than a year now. We know where the puck is going, if you will. Many of them, the deadlines are still, upon us. But what happens in healthcare, right, is that regulations come out and we all start moving to get there before the deadline. So Michael, maybe if you want to start us out, what impact have these regulations already had in our industry?
Yeah, so thanks, Niko, for the question. I think the first thing is just the normally when these types of regulations come out from a combination of ONC and CMS, they're generally built around some technology certification a period where you build a bunch of capability, you get it certified, and then your product's out in market being used. I think what's really unique about this set for Cures is there's two chunks of it. There's, of course, all that R4 and EHI export and all the capability you need to have. But first, as impacted in April, is the behavior of info blocking is already into effect. And while I think the kind of R4 environment that will proceed through the regulation into the 2022 and 2023 years of the rule will be impactful. That first step of having specific behaviors incented and regulated is I think, unique and different about this rule. And I think right now what's happening is you're seeing companies, including Athenahealth, taking their existing FHIR endpoints, maybe they were the DSTU2 set from the last version of MU, and building new approaches to things like PHR access, different swings in their partnership and interoperability programs as a result of the response. So I think that's something that's pretty different. Is there's this whole set of business mechanisms, relationship mechanisms that are coming about ahead of, and perhaps I would argue more influentially than just the pure kind of tech certification, which is more typically how these various regulations have played out in the past decade or so.
Nice. I'd also like to hear from BJ on how PointClickCare is thinking about this, in the skilled nursing space, and obviously a huge piece of coordination as far as care goes between the acute setting and post-acute. How have the regulations affected your strategy in thinking about this space?
Yeah, thanks on that. I think we sit in a little bit of an interesting spot, primarily because when you're a patient or a resident at a long-term post-acute care facility, you're often, the family members are also needing their hands on data too, right? It's not just about you only. And so how do you empower that whole mission? For a long time, that the long-term post-acute side of the healthcare business has sort of operated a bit in a black hole, right? I think as patients transition, we're still kind of supporting fax machines and others in that space. And so I think what we see coming and what we're excited about is really twofold. Number one, how can those transitions, so think about the gaps as someone moves from, let's say, the hospital into the skilled nursing facility or back home, how can we make those as seamless and sort of pain-free as possible? And what this has done is it's make it easier to access, whether you're a provider or a vendor, to go out there and grab that data so that full picture comes in before they show up at the facility. And then conversely, while they're in that post-acute center that PointClickCare is probably providing, how do we open that up for those other vendors who can innovate and drive, whether it's family communication or patient engagement or others? So I think that's a lot of points around how do we solve the problem through more access to that data. And we're excited that the post-acute providers can have a seat at that table where they haven't always had in the past.
Nice. A big piece of this is bringing the patient front and center. Sarah, how do you think the patient's role will change in interoperability? How do you think healthcare will change for patients based on these new rules?
Thank you, Niko. So it's interesting to look at the evolution of the medical note and the primary drivers, right? So the Egyptians used to use papyrus to transcribe surgical cases, and I believe that was the first known medical note. Clinicians used private journals that they tucked away into their desk drawers or bookshelves in the 18th century. Notes were integrated into medical records in the 20th century, and then the electronic record was actually introduced in the 80s, right? And all that time, the notes were primarily for the clinician to reference, and we could never really see what the doctor was writing. And now the medical note has finally evolved into a communication tool that will ideally help build trust with the patient. And the 21st Century Cures Act demonstrates a huge shift from paternalistic medicine to participatory medicine that evens out the power imbalance we sometimes see in the patient-doctor relationship, emphasizing this whole notion of partnership and collaboration. And my life motto that I created last year as part of a health equity manifesto is transparency is the most disruptive innovation of the 21st century. And so I'm excited that we're no longer just talking about transparency and collaboration and really putting action behind those words with the 21st Century Cures Act and open notes, which I wholeheartedly believe will help build trust with clinicians, rebuild trust in healthcare over time. And in the next year, I'd like to see more work done in how this transparency will help address the inequities in healthcare so that we don't leave any patient behind, right? Our work here is not done with this remarkable progress that we've made in data access.
Nice. Yeah, I think a lot about how if we give patients all of the information that providers are tracking on them, and then of course patients have Dr. Google and can start tying this information together, it puts them in a position to act more like consumers, where they can make decisions on their own, They can drive their own care. They can hopefully be more engaged in it. But that really does start to change how providers are interacting with patients, because as you mentioned, we're coming out of kind of this paternalistic view of the provider is all knowing and will guide the patient, to now the provider needs to collaborate and figure out how to take in inputs from a care team that could be wildly dispersed. Michael, I want to go to you, because Athena's sitting front and center in this, working with providers on a day-to-day basis. How will the provider's role change in this as they're starting to see, as potentially they will start to see patients who are more informed and come with more data from different places?
Yeah, I think there's two or three pieces about it from a provider lens. There's kind of provider as an organization, a practice, a health system, what have you. And this creates, I think a couple of folks are calling it kind of an omni-channel healthcare patient experience and engagement environment. So if the patient's bringing you their app and their data environment to you as an organization or to your provider, that's a real challenge to most organizations. Whereas in the past and in recent history is, I'm going to have a patient brand, I'm going to have a patient experience, it's going to be universal and cohesive, it's going to span my inpatient, my ambulatory, I'm going to have this, I'm going to have that. And now we're in an environment where this is positioned to create a default omni-channel environment for every single health provider in the country. So I think that's pretty different for most provider organizations. I think it means that most provider organizations have to invest in, being a guy with platform in his title, at the platform tier in terms of interacting with all those different ecosystems. How am I getting data in, data out? How do I have more generic tools around who that patient is, what access do they have, what networks are they a part of? So that's part one, is what does it mean to be kind of engaging your patients in this omni-channel way? The second part is, and I think Sarah and BJ kind of alluded to this, is does this set the stage for this? This idea has been out there for a while, so-called patient-mediated data exchange or patient-mediated health information exchange. And if you have this environment out there, the demand and availability and opportunity for the return trip of that consolidated data back to the provider, augmented with device data, augmented with social factors, pick your favorite set of data to include into a healthcare data set. What are the obligations of a provider organization or an individual provider to interact with that on the return trip? And I think it points a little bit to one of the questions, in the chat of, how do you kind of build workflows and think through that? And that to me is the second piece of this puzzle, and maybe 2 or 3 years out, but you can see the natural evolution of the apps and industry towards that direction. And then I think the third piece is a little bit to what Sarah is mentioning about the role of the medical record and the relationship between a clinician and their notes, as something that was really about support and service of how that individual worked. This is how I write my notes. When I went to my training, this is how I did my SOAP, and this is how I document. To something that is a little bit more of a more like a social network post of, I'm going to communicate to a care team, I'm going to communicate to a set of caregivers through this data, through this document, and have it be more of a work product to be shared than something to facilitate my own processes and thinking as a provider. And I think that's something that's pretty new, and I don't think has permeated across all provider groups, but you certainly see some organizations really thinking of that node as that tool. So if you look at those three, we think of it as summing up to this idea of ecosystem, or this idea of platforms of providers now participating in these activities in a much more network way, particularly outside of the bounds of their traditional, I'm at my health system, at my practice, I'm at my group. And this is really a common resource, which is pretty unique and different.
Yeah, and Niko, if I may add to that, just that last point, there's power in the words that we use, right? They can impact our thoughts, our emotions, our actions, but words also have the power to guide and motivate. They can confuse, they can mislead, they can hurt us. And the intent of a word that's written in a record can be misinterpreted, leading to that unintended consequence. And so if we follow the ripple effect of our words to understand the emotions and or the behaviors, the decisions they may potentially trigger, would it force us to kind of pause think and perhaps communicate a little differently. So that being said, many institutions have actually sent out lists to doctors about what not to write in the charts and how to document in a neutral and an objective way that won't be offensive to patients. Things like drug-seeking abuse or frequent flyers, certain terms that the clinician has typically used in a medical record that was between them and other clinicians are now sort of open to patients. And so it's also learning how to write in a different way, if you will, as we pave this path forward.
I think this is a wonderfully nuanced point here around how documentation will inevitably have to change. We talked a little bit, and Sarah, you brought in the conversation about the history of documentation within a medical record, right? It really started as providers taking notes for themselves. So when they see a patient come back, in a month or in a year, they can look back at those notes. With electronic health record adoption, and really within paying for healthcare through insurance, a lot of that documentation turned into how we actually get paid, so how providers get paid for their care. So the documentation purpose really kind of shifted. And with these new regulations, we're likely going to see another shift, as Michael put it. It's almost like the documentation will be like a social media post, because you can absolutely imagine that applications will be created that use social media like heuristics to pull in what's going on with your healthcare into a feed. So as a patient or as a loved one who I might share my patient data with, they can see it as a social media feed, and that might change how doctors need to document their care. What do you think might be unintended consequences of these shifts? As the data is opened up more, are there negatives to this, or how will providers and patients need to be thinking of this differently? And I'll open that up to any of the panelists, because I think we probably all have insight on how that might change.
I'll jump in. I'm maybe from a bit of a different perspective, which is we're kind of going through a bit of like our third or fourth evolution here, right? If you think about even when meaningful use first came in and we started moving all of our paper forms into the cloud, right? I mean, we essentially, like, I remember trying to implement an EHR and everyone was like, well, we spent so much money on this big binder full of forms. Can you make that electronic? And we did that, but we didn't really change any of the processes around that, right? And then we started saying, wait, I wish I could get some intelligence out of here. And we're like, well, we really can't, because it's all these disparate parts. And so that second evolution went in to say, how do we make this data a little bit more universally insightful? And I think what we're approaching now, as you guys have all sort of mentioned, is sort of how do we make it useful and meaningful, and to eliminate those blind spots along a patient journey that we've all been used to. So I'll give you an example of just near to what our customer base is. It's middle of the night, and a patient from a senior who's maybe has some slight dementia or a couple other comorbidities has to go to the ED, can't speak very well, shows up at the hospital. The ED doc may have no idea, right? Can't do the traditional conversation. How do we get rid of that blind spot, but not just dump a bunch of information? How do we provide insight, right? And so I think that's really critical to make that work. I think an unintended consequence may be that we over process, to Sarah's point, that we're afraid to put too many things in here that make that insight just another bland, non-actionable piece of data. So I think we need to make sure we're focusing on the outcome and not the regulatory side to drive the behavior we want.
Yeah, and going back to the comment I made about words, we know that implicit bias has been an issue in healthcare. And again, the words that a clinician uses in a patient's record, it can reflect that bias. And so thoughtfully using humanizing words in a note can help alleviate some of those biases. That can also be transferred from one clinician to another in a patient's record, right? There was a recent study that actually explored whether stigmatizing language could influence a physician's attitudes towards a patient in the decision-making process. For example, treating a patient's pain less aggressively if a patient was labeled a certain way in the chart. And they found that stigmatizing language is more likely to perpetuate that bias and adversely affect patient care. And in addition, so at the Health Collaboratory, we have something called the Patient Shark Tank. We created it back in 2011 with the intent of amplifying the voice of the patient, the care partner, the clinician, and the design of the future of healthcare. And we've engaged close to 20,000 patients and care partners across conditions globally. And although there are expert patients and care partners who are part of the tribe, the majority have never interfaced with anyone in the healthcare ecosystem outside of their healthcare team. They're not going to the conferences, they're not on social media, and approximately 70% of those voices are from underrepresented groups. They're harder to reach. Many don't realize they have a voice or a role to play in reshaping healthcare, which is why we've been focused on ensuring that they're part of the conversation. They're the hidden gems that need to be part of our work in co-designing the future of healthcare. And so we have 12 different models to engage these patients to allow for everything from co-design to deep dive assessments to rapid fire insights. And we've been doing a series of rapid fire insight queries to understand real world implementation. And we'll continue to do this to gather feedback on their overall experiences, but we had 640 patients respond to a query where 78% didn't know they now had access to their data since no one told them. Well, they all know now, but the issue is, where is the awareness campaign, right? We had Earth Day all over the media earlier this week. Where was the Data Liberación Day, right? It can't be a hidden secret we keep to ourselves unless people ask for access. We have a major trust issue in healthcare, and this is a way for every health organization, every clinician to tackle this problem. And let's share best practices and the lessons that we learn along the way as we all stumble to figure this out so that we can restore trust and faith in healthcare. I could talk about this topic all day, Niko, so let's get started.
I love that. We need a holiday. Maybe it should be April 23rd. Might be too close to Earth Day. But what that made me think of is, do we have misaligned incentives here, especially for health systems who are very large and serve patients across different care settings and take risk on those patients? You might look at interoperability as like asking Walmart and Target to share customer data with each other. Like, they're not going to do it, because the more they can know about the consumers who use their products and services, the more they can effectively keep them in their ecosystems. In the value-based care world, we call this leakage, right? If a patient leaves a care setting controlled by that entity and goes outside of it, is one of the unintended consequences here that value-based care might take a step backwards because of forcing really health systems to share data with potential competitors who are across the street. Michael, I imagine that you've thought a lot about this, and your customers have thought a lot about this. Is this something that comes up, or is this kind of an unspoken incentive behind the scenes?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of a ways up, but I think you can see where that goes, where this idea of managing panels, establishing a network, managing value-based referral patterns and the like, starts to become a little bit easier to do when the traditional, barriers to care coordination around the continuity of patient record and the subtext to that referral and everything else becomes a little bit more fluid. I don't think of it so much as an unaligned incentive, so much as like many technology progressions, there's kind of both ways to play it. So if you're a growth-oriented network and you're trying to build a high-performing care pathway or pattern, in attracting patients to that network, you have a lot of advantage. If you're on the other side of that, then maybe you don't. And so I think it is not necessarily inherently against a value-based care. I think it just provides another lever that you can say, hey, we're going to be ecosystem oriented. We're going to really think about how we specialize in what types of care pathways to create good value, and maybe be okay realigning the set of care offerings we have to what we're really good at, and partnering with those who are better at other things on a value premise. So I think that's generally one of the themes or implications of value-based care, is to try and get a little bit more specialization and outcomes in certain areas rather than just controlling revenue overall. So I think it can be both used as an advantage. And if you're threatened by that and not prepared to handle, a foreign data exchange, not prepared to be thinking about omni-channel patient experience, that might be more of a constraint. So both sides, I think, definitely possible. I don't think inherently against VBC, but something to definitely be factoring into your strategy over the next 2, 3, 4 years.
Yeah, I'd echo that, Michael. I kind of get excited about that topic. Unintended may not be negative. I think there's inherent advantages to some of these closed networks today that maybe we get to open up the doors a little bit. And I think if you're a provider that's working with one of these VBC organizations, you probably have an interesting chance to form better partnerships if you're more aggressive in taking advantage of it, right? And so I think it creates an opportunity to do that as well.
Yeah, I would add it to me, what we've talked about thematically, it flips a little bit about the narrative. What does it mean to be high performing in terms of, schedule yield and schedule density and good quality metrics and the like. And it starts to flip this. How easy are we to do business with as a system? How easy are we able to bring data in? Because once this data is going, the question is, okay, I really just want to get to a next convenient visit. I want to get to a next convenient consult. I want to just show up and have things work now that this thing is fairly portable in terms of, my health record, my experience. And so you start to flip a lot of the mechanics that the industry's built up over the last 10 years, which is how do I make my system really effective, to how do I make my system as easy to do business with, as easy to interact with as it can with all these external sources. And I think that flips the whole position of how most organizations are thinking about their ecosystem, their app strategy, their patient experience strategy. It really inverts it. And I think that's the most key thing that will separate those who take advantage of this and those who don't over the coming years.
BJ, I feel like there's a thread here with, there's generally this move away from the inpatient setting because of its high cost, especially in risk-based environments, and probably a growth in the post-acute world. I know that PointClickCare just recently acquired Collective, and of course, Collective has a network that can understand where patients are receiving care. Can you speak to how you're thinking about that from PointClickCare strategy, looking at the post-acute and the long-term care space and how that's growing based on these trends?
Yeah, it's actually super interesting and compelling in this discussion, in that if you think about what we've seen over time is that and even the pandemic has sort of thrust this forward a little bit, which is nobody really wants to have their family members or loved ones go to a skilled nursing facility if it's not clinically appropriate, right? I think the idea is that how do we make sure that post-acute journey is filled with you go to the right place for the right amount of time for where you need it. And I think that also includes beginning to see things like SNF services at home and home health services being provided in the senior living community and beyond. And so that data liquidity, actually just this week I had a conversation with a large senior living provider who said, hey, we want to be able to be better at sharing our data as people come and go, because this is the home, and how do we empower more things to happen at home? And so from our strategy has been, we traditionally have thought about sort of seniors and empowering them in the services, in the buildings. They kind of think about that and where they get care, right? How do we optimize those? We're beginning to start to say, how do we connect those dots? And then what we looked at Collective, the addition of Collective to our portfolio really allows us to say, we want to eliminate the gaps in care, the problems that happen as any vulnerable senior population goes from spot to spot along the journey, right? Whether it's showing back up at the ED or going from a SNF into the home and vice versa, and empower that care team. And what the Collective team has done over the years is really, through a lot of hard work and connection, built reasons why you can get that data connection. And I think it's been fantastic. Now we have, with some of the rules that we've been talking about today, the question is we believe we can now push more insights across that network and free that data up more to help those patients. So, probably a long answer, Niko. We could probably talk an hour about that. But I think the idea is that let's make sure that we've got the connectivity and the access to so that we're not forcing care or insights to happen where they're at, but along the journey, the whole way.
Yep. And a quick pause for the audience. I see your questions in there, Anthony and Amanda. Really great questions. We're going to get to that, but I want to encourage others, if something comes up for you as we're discussing, throw it in the chat. We'll see if we can weave it into the conversation. So far, these questions, absolutely, we're gonna pull in. But before I go there, I kind of want to take a step back to some of these potential unintended consequences. And when these rules were in kind of draft mode, there was a comment period where folks in the industry can make comments about concerns they have, can make comments about what they like and what they don't like. And famously, my old boss over at Epic really made a comment around these regulations, saying that it opens up the potential for patients to inadvertently share data with potential bad actors, and it kind of hearkening back to the scandals, the Cambridge Analytica scandals of the election, where consumers, unbeknownst to them, share data with data collectors who are going to use that data to better target political campaigns through an application that they authorized access to their Facebook data. And of course, medical data is far more interesting and valuable than who your friends are on Facebook. So Sarah, I want to bring you into the conversation. Did you just talk a little bit about the privacy implications of giving data directly to patients, and is that something we need to be concerned about, or is that really just the responsibility of the sovereign patient to make that decision and to be responsible with their own data?
I definitely think that there's an opportunity to educate the patient, because again, they're not aware of some of these new regulations, and they're not necessarily aware of who's potentially going to be able to access that data. And it's interesting because, another layer to this is, and we've talked a little bit about this, Niko, but I've been working on a research project for a couple of years now, where I've collected over 5,000 anonymous confessions of what people have concealed from their doctors or lied to their doctors about. And instead of tucking the data away into a research study that only people like, you and I might see, I've been working on a book called Health Confessions to put this data back into the hands of people so that they can understand the potential ripple effect of lying to their doctor. And so one of the things I'm further researching for the book is, through the power of anonymous confessions, is how will this affect what people openly share with their doctors? Can certain admissions be kept off the record, for instance? And one of the chapters in the book has kind of been focused on the dark side of medicine and getting people to understand the data trail. And if a patient can potentially follow the data trail and understand how their data is being utilized today, well, yesterday, I should say, as well as today, based on these new regulations, will it potentially lead to the unintended consequence of them sharing less with their clinician? And that's obviously something we don't want, because there can be a ripple effect to that. And so how do we ensure that as people start to understand how their data is being utilized, it doesn't inadvertently cause them to potentially keep that data close to home and not openly share it, when in fact we know that it can potentially improve their health and affect their health greatly?
Michael or BJ, do you have anything to add on the privacy implications of sharing data directly with patients?
Yeah, I'm super intrigued. I've heard that Sarah say this twice now, and she gets me thinking each time about that. A little bit different from that angle. I think that there are some friction points between sort of our need for and the security requirements, right? Even and the rules. And I think that as we start to look at it, there's going to be some questions about, how do we, do we let, like in our case, does PointClickCare have a certain rules for allowing certain vendors to connect with them that in Michael and Athena have different rules, right? And how do we identify that? So I think that's going to be a path we're going to have to really identify. And, we've got some good guidance around like treatment use cases and others, but I think that's going to be what's going to come next.
Well, and where are we with rewriting HIPAA? Because when you think about, how de-identified is easily re-identified, there's a tremendous amount of work that we need to do there to ensure that, this whole notion of patient privacy is actually patient privacy, because the way it stands today, there's so many organizations that are focused on re-identifying that data. So I think it does open up a can of worms.
Certainly. I think this is a great place to transition into Anthony's question. And if I was to embody his question, I think some context that would be required here is a lot of what we've been talking about today is in the world of patient authorized and patient mediated data exchange. I categorize interoperability into kind of three buckets. The newest one, the one that this regulation really pulls forth and shines a light on, is how do we get the data into the hands of the patients so they can mediate their own data exchange through applications that they choose to work with. So the choice is on the patient to do that. There's also treatment use cases, which is where providers who are taking care of the same patient decide to share data behind the scenes so that, if you show up at the emergency department, in a place you've never been to before, can they get their hands on your past medical records so they understand, what might be going on with you, your allergies, your past medical conditions, and those sorts of things. So that is really enterprise to enterprise interoperability. The third bucket, and this is what Anthony is asking about, is what about application integration? So this is where a healthcare organization might be using an application to better serve the patient that they're working with and needs to share data with that application. This is typically done through in the HIPAA constructs, the business associate agreement, where the healthcare organization says this entity, this vendor is a business associate of ours, and we need to share data with that vendor. And so, as some examples here, right, like telehealth vendors or remote patient monitoring or care coordination, pop health, any sort of digital health vendor who is working directly with a health system. How are we thinking about the differences between these types of integrations, and why is application integration important? And Michael, I want to bring you into this first, because of course Athenahealth was really a pioneer in thinking about the application ecosystem that should be surrounding the electronic health record, and the power of that for providing efficiencies, providing better clinical outcomes, providing better financial outcomes for healthcare organizations. Michael, how are you thinking about that space? How are you continuing to think about that space as far as actual applications integrating into the workflow to better serve patients, really on the business side of this rather than on the direct to patient side?
Yeah, I think it's critical. I think it's very difficult to do any of the things in Anthony's question without great application integration tools. And I think there's really three tiers to evaluate. So the first is, okay, getting data out, whether it's, a little bit more recent history is, okay, let's exchange a bunch of CCDAs. Now we have discrete RESTful APIs and Fireshape to go do that. Okay, that's great. But I think the questions to ask are really about, once again, we call it the round trip or writability. So can you populate an order based on a clinical decision methodology? Can you schedule an appointment to close a care gap? Can you add to the chart through that API if you're creating that synthesized patient record that's longitudinal from these sources? So we talk about writability. We really, at Athena, we're very proud of our writability. You can basically take an update or create action on any object in Athena through our API. So we think that's kind of critical part one in terms of application integration. Next up is actually workflows. And I think there's two tiers to that. One is using smart and other, embedded app type workflows to say, okay, I can pass patient context to a workflow and kind of embed it next to this piece of my application. So I might have like a special pop health app that pops up next to my patient chart. And I think those are very helpful, but to me largely represent a kind of intermediate step. I think the last step in this is we call it, the inside out EHR, is starting to invert how a lot of product development and a lot of data strategy works in the health IT space, to instead start building products that are designed from the outset for third-party interactions. So for example, we're starting to do this in the pop health space with things like gaps in care, and say, we're going to build a quality management workflow specifically for third-party views to be integrated into our EHR. And I think that's the last piece of this, is saying, not just that, can you have great read-write transactions, not just can there be a good kind of UI interaction layer, but there's literally purpose-built interactions in your product for third parties to populate, for your users to take action on, and for that to be embedded, we call it natively in the workflow. So I think it's an incredibly important point. It's certainly where we're investing a lot of our time. It's how we've seen the evolution of app integration through the course of our experience at Athena. And we think it's a critical space to keep investing in.
Ooh, you gave me goosebumps there thinking about building the EHR for integration first to bring application data into it. I think that's huge. This ties in really well with Raphael's question around open API libraries. The regulations, of course, call out that FHIR R4 is going to be the API, but really the regulations only say that we need the US CDI data set, so a limited amount of data through that. It's only read only. So what that means is the regulations have only obligated EHRs and their customers to use FHIR for that specific data set and to read through that data set. What about all of the other aspects beyond that data set and even writing back in, right? Because FHIR doesn't specify how potentially to write that back in. Where are those APIs, and how do we start seeing standardization around those? And of course, Redox is front and center in the middle of this. With Redox has our own APIs that we've developed for developers. Athena, of course, has developed their own APIs that are different from Redox's. PointClickCare has their own APIs that are different. So in some senses, there are API libraries that you can find, but in order to interact with the broad swath of healthcare, you have to have a really mixed strategy working with different vendors and different APIs in order to accomplish potentially the same workflow across those. So BJ or Michael, how are you thinking about how we should start to standardize around functionality so developers like Raphael can have a unified experience and actually build something that scales?
I'll take it first, but first, Michael, awesome answer, right? Because I love where you were going on the last one. Let me answer it a little bit different way than we get into specifics, but I'm going to kind of combine with Anthony's question too, which is I really think that we have to set out to leverage whether it's cures or other interoperability to actually make a measurable, meaningful difference. Like our goals of success, please don't let if you're at a system and you're working, your goals of success equal 100 or 80% of all transitions equal integrated, right? That's not good enough. I can think back even in the post-acute setting, how many times that we were excited because we moved away from a fax to a PDF, and all that PDF did was just sit there and no one looked at it, right? Like PDFs don't equal avoiding medication problems on admission, right? So let's measure, did we reduce negative outcomes in each setting? And I bring that up because I believe that the way for us to get further down the regulatory paths is to actually show that where we're at is working and meaningfully making a difference, right? And I think that that's how we'll get there in general. So I'll get off my soapbox in a moment, but I think just more technically to help Raphael and team is I think I see PointClickCare starting, we modeled our program very much off of Athenahealth. So thanks, Michael. But just to kind of open that up for other vendors, we definitely have some proprietary APIs in there. We're trying to work with groups like Niko and Redox and others to say, how do we bring them together? I think it's probably going to be a bit of a lag when other groups as Athena and PointClickCare get connected. We're going to get tired of doing things multiple ways, right? And so I think just to continue to encourage that and see those kind of beginning to merge together.
I would add to that. I think to the first question, I think most major vendors at this point have developer.company.com where their APIs are published and accessible. So I think part one is I think there's this semi-strange reputation at this point, it's tough to really build an app or get access to healthcare, where at this point the vast majority of the industry has either through kind of Niko's team at Redox or other companies the ability to do this. I think that's just a kind of a little bit of a fallacy at this point. I think 10 years ago it was certainly true. I think at this point in time it's pretty much just myth. And if you wanted to build an app at virtually any major EHR practice management. They all have different approaches, they all have different ways, and I won't do too much competitive kind of commentary on that, but I think it's generally possible at most places. I think with regard to standardization on read versus write versus transactions, I think you're going to want to continue to standardize. We call it kind of FHIR++ of some core data assets that are pretty similar to do, because as we build apps, we're going to want to span across other EHRs and all that. So there's a nice incentive for, I would say, the core core objects, core functions, core actions in healthcare. I would say I don't think you actually want standardization on everything though. Because you want companies to invest in niches that are underserved, that need special workflows, that need differentiation. And so if you think about where a lot of the challenges are, particularly in the health IT industry, where healthcare, even just say take ambulatory healthcare, forget about healthcare overall, is really dozens of smaller submarkets that all have their different needs. You want to enable a world where you have great niche finding, great product market fit finding, and you don't want to over specify a regulation. So my view is get some of the core objects around a patient, but when you get into API standardization for workflows that start to get away from kind of the patient and the patient's care, I think you actually want to get into a world where you allow differentiation, you allow specialization, you allow innovation. I think that's something we want to keep going forward on, just so we don't get to a overly standardized venue where we actually limit how much of that niche finding value creation we can do in different pockets and new care delivery models. And it's a really interesting time too, because a lot of the MU specs in the world were kind of built around these like idealized views of this is eligible practitioners for ambulatory have these requirements and inpatient has these requirements. And then now what you think about when you actually interact with most care delivery organizations, the spectrum and model of models, a little bit of virtual, a little bit of care management, a little bit of primary care, then out with this kind of care team, and how much of that is being invented and specialized and differentiated. I don't think you want to over specify the workflows, because I think it's actually really what healthcare needs is to create those higher value methods at the right place and avoid these overfitted models that don't actually create value and quality for the right type of care for the right type of patient. So that's my soapbox on kind of the standards in API world.
By the way, I think a great example of that, and one of the third questions, is in family and patient engagement. Because I think there's a lot of really good innovation happening in that space, but there's not a one size fits all, right? And I think we want to empower those vendors in that way.
Nice, yeah. Great point. And thanks for pulling in that other question. As we get to the end of this session, I can't believe how quickly it passed. I want to give us all an opportunity to reflect on what we just talked about and on the changes that are upon us in healthcare, right? We not only have we seen tons of changes that were catalyzed by the huge shift that was the pandemic, but we're also seeing interoperability start to take a turn. We've been talking about interoperability for over a decade, right? That's when regulation started appearing about it. That's when the demand started appearing about it. I feel like we're on the cusp of something new, of something different here. And I'd love to just, in the last 5 minutes, let each of our panelists kind of give us a summarizing statement of what they think the future will hold at this turning point, if this is a turning point in our industry around interoperability. What will the next decade hold for us as data is more available, and what are you excited about? So Sarah, do you want to start us off with trying to give us some insight into what you think the future will hold as we open the data up more in this space?
Absolutely. So interoperability, obviously, it ignites that participatory relationship with the patient, allowing them to better coordinate their care longitudinally. It allows them to connect the dots across all touch points, right? Not just giving the patient a bird's eye view of their health, but also for doctors to exchange information. It gives the patient more power to get second opinions, correct mistakes, omissions. The medical note can now evolve into a teaching or an educational tool to communicate and ideally build trust, right, with the patient or with the clinician, I should say, reinforcing a diagnosis, treatment recommendations, next steps. provides an opportunity for patients to ask questions based on the terminology they see and make informed decisions. But as we talk about the importance of getting to know the whole person rather than just focus on the patient or disease, there's a nice opportunity for patients to see that their doctor was actually listening to them by the words that are reflected in the medical record, right? I see an opportunity to build trust and partnership through the use of things like narrative medicine, where clinicians take the time to hear the patient's story, to gain a deeper understanding of that patient's experience, their emotions, their beliefs, their values that might influence a patient's health, which can lend itself to treating a patient in a more holistic way. So I definitely see better partnerships, if you will. But I think the big thing that we have to focus on going forward, because our work does not stop here, is this whole notion of focusing on how this could potentially help alleviate inequities, but also realize that it's not just access to data that people want, it's access to understanding of that data. And so I think an important layer to this will be focused on the translation, because we can't just leave it at the patient now has access and kind of, the weight of the world is on their shoulders, but really focus on how we can create tools that translate that data over time.
Nice. Okay, Michael, what are you sitting with? And then we'll have BJ round us out for the session.
All right, I'll try to incorporate the last comment, I think, from Janet into it. I think not just in the provider side, but also in the payer side and all the other ancillary services, is we're in this period of shift from kind of applications and workflows and services to platforms and ecosystems. I think it's really exciting. So if you think about something like where you see, things like Da Vinci popping up in terms of payer-provider collaboration to eliminate a lot of the spreadsheets and compensatory work that Janet cites, I think what you'll see over the next 5-10 years is the parlance of the industry and approach to really taking this more view of these broader national ecosystems, national level collaborations, national level data exchange, to try and get rid of all of that, regional pocket and controlling type workflows. So something that's much more about ecosystem to ecosystem communication. I think that will change a tremendous amount from who's registering what at the front desk of a practice all the way through to how you administer a value-based care contract. So I think we're at the early stages of it, and it'll be a really exciting next decade on this front.
And I'll try to maybe summarize. I'm stealing a little bit from both, but I think that the answer here is I'm really excited to start moving away from access and moving towards sort of insights in action. And what I mean by that is that we're going to open the floodgates. No one may know what to do with it. It's time to stop having that conversation about how do we get it and start turning it into behavior. And I think that's where we're starting to get into, and innovation is going to be fun in that space.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, first off, to our panelists for sharing your insight and knowledge. And secondly, to all of the guests here who participated. I think that the questions have been amazing. I really wish we could get into more discussion around them, but alas, our time has come. I just sent a note. I'm going to be on Twitter. I'll hang out during the day and we can keep the conversation going if anyone wants to jump in there. Looks like we're getting a head nod from BJ too, so he might join us. So I'm sure MedCity has a hashtag that they're using for this event, and we can probably hop on there and keep the conversation going. But that being said, I'll kick it back over to whoever's actually in charge around here, and we'll let the event continue.
Niko, thank you very much for that. One of the questions in the chat harkens back to an experience I had as a reporter. And actually, I'm going to share this story and ask a question of Sarah. This was more than 5 years ago, 6 or 7 years ago. There was a gentleman named Hugo Campos, I believe. He was very big in the nothing about me, without me movement. And he had an implantable cardiac defibrillator. And he was trying to get the raw data from Medtronic. And every time he would ask for that information, Medtronic would say, well, all the doctors would say, what are you going to do with it? And he was very frustrated. And then Omar Ishrak took over. He's now left as Medtronic's chairman and CEO, but he was one of the first CEOs in the medical device world to use Twitter. So he began to tweet, and one day, I believe he shared one of those Run app data. I think it was Runtastic. And he put it on his Twitter that this is my data for my morning run. And then Hugo tweeted at him directly saying, isn't it nice to be able to access your own data? Something that I've been trying to do for ages. And Omar actually made it happen. He was able, Ugo was able to get his raw data. They had to create some software mechanism so he was able to get that data on his end. It was reams and reams of unreadable and probably not fully understood data. So I wanted to go back to what one of the questions in the audience has made. How do we get, like, Sarah, do you have patients that say, great, we're getting access to data, but we're not understanding? So how do you get doctors to write in a more intelligible way, get away from the acronyms and things like that?
Absolutely. So Hugo's a dear friend, and yeah, that was a remarkable story about hacking into his own device to get his own data. And, we often say, we hear this from patients all the time, it's not access to data that I want, it's access to understanding of that data. And we've been creating a series of tools to help translate things like the lab values, simple things. But it is important for us to think about it. And I saw a question as it relates to healthcare professionals potentially learning a new language, if you will. And we're working with a couple of medical education providers to teach clinicians how best to write that medical note, recognizing it's not just for other clinicians anymore, right? So it's a matter of clinicians learning a new language, if you will, as it relates to patient education, using that as a communication tool at the point of care to bring the patient into the conversation. We're actually seeing some best practices emerge where during the televisit, the clinicians are able to share that note real time so that the patient sees what they're writing. Mm-hmm. And it allows, again, for that education to manifest. But it is important for us to ensure that as people get access to all this data, we live in an era of information overload. And we really need to, if you truly want from the patient standpoint for them to take that data, that access, and really convert that to action and engagement, we have to ensure that we're also arming them with the appropriate tools to make that happen. And so healthcare for many is like a foreign flick, right? A foreign movie without the subtitles. And it's up to each and every one of us to provide those subtitles. So we have some work to do in this space. I think it's a huge opportunity, but we have a lot of work to do in this space to ensure that, again, we're not leaving patients behind.
Great. Well, on that positive note, thank you very much to Niko, Sarah, Michael, and BJ for this great session. Interoperability can be dry, but you guys didn't make it dry. So I appreciate that. Just a quick programming note. We have our final pitch session of the day at 12 Eastern. At 3 Eastern, 12 Pacific. So I hope to see some of you come back to watch our pitch track on health services. Thank you again, and stay safe and get vaccinated. Bye, you guys.